Powerful insights often occur when you least expect them. On Transformative Leadership Conversations, they're at the heart of every episode. Hi, I'm your host, Winnie Da Silva, and together we're exploring a spectrum of leadership themes through the compelling stories and insights of seasoned leaders and prominent experts. And each episode, you'll walk away with inspiration, strategies, and tools to enhance your leadership, build effective teams, and lead thriving organizations. So if you remember, back in June, just in time for graduation, I shared insights from my daughter and her classmates on their views of leadership today. So this September, just in time for school to start again, this time we're exploring how business school students are rethinking leadership, what it means, how it works, and what's changed for them since starting their MBA program. Because I've been pondering this question. What happens when future business leaders are given the space to reflect, learn, and explore different leadership theories? How does that change the way they think about what leadership actually means? In this special bonus episode, I've invited a special guest, Gerard Beenen. Gerard is a professor of management, a leadership consultant, and an expert in workplace motivation and organizational change. He teaches leadership and organizational behavior at Cal State Fullerton and also serves as an adjunct professor in the MBA programs at both UC Irvine and Carnegie Mellon University. His career spans both business and academia. Before earning his PhD in organizational behavior from Carnegie Mellon, Gerard held roles as a healthcare CEO, a high-tech entrepreneur, and a consultant at Bain & Company and Ernst & Young. He brings a rare blend of scholarly depth and real-world experience to the question of how leadership is taught, practiced, and evolving, which, of course, makes him the perfect person to join me for this very conversation. So during this bonus episode, Gerard and I will hear directly from his MBA students at Carnegie Mellon about how their views on leadership have evolved and how their insights can help all of us better understand what leadership looks like at its very best. In one of his MBA leadership courses, Gerard offered students the opportunity to reflect on their own learning by answering this question. In a brief audio recording, 2 minutes or less, describe how you use to define effective leadership, how you define it now, and what experiences prompted that shift. So today, we're going to share a sampling of those reflections and connect them to two powerful leadership theories: transformational leadership theory and self-determination theory. So you might want to think of this as a mini masterclass, grounded in theory and brought to life through the voices of MBA students. So before we dive into the student reflections, I've asked Gerard to kick us off with a brief history of leadership theory, just enough context for the two frameworks we'll be exploring today.
Let's kind of rewind the clock a little bit to sort of after World War II is kind of when leadership research really kind of got jump started. Because prior to that time, we thought about leaders, not leadership. We thought about what we call great person leadership theory, which is really that leaders are born, not made. And so we think about leaders as people are either born a leader or not. And that's that. And what had happened after the war is that Ohio State and University of Michigan both decided, well, let's think about leadership, not leaders per se, and what specific skills does it take to become a leader or to demonstrate leadership. And both research programs independently came upon the sort of what's commonly known as task and person-oriented leadership, which most of us have seen that matrix about being more task versus people-oriented, right? So that was kind of known as behavioral theory. Now that evolved into understanding that context matters and that sometimes you need to be more task-focused, sometimes you need to be more behavior or person-focused. We won't get into the details of when that is, but that's called contingency theory, which basically is a way of saying the situation matters. So from there, we kind of moved into more contemporary modern theories, which is transformational leadership theory is part of what's called the full range model of leadership. And so, if you think about it as a continuum, it really starts with what we'd call laissez faire style, which is really not leadership at all. It's just kind of laying back, kicking back, which, believe it or not, sometimes is appropriate, especially when people are self led, when they don't need a lot of structure. But then you move from there to what we call a management by exception approach, which is more like the micromanager who jumps in, swoops in when he sees or she sees something wrong and corrects it and really sort of is breathing down your neck. And that's really not an effective way to lead. We move from there to what is kind of the legacy of the task oriented leadership that we talked about earlier, which is called transactional leadership. And what transactional leadership is really about is a transaction between manager or leader and subordinate, where you agree to the performance norms and expectations. The subordinate agrees to get that work done. There's literally a handshake between the two, and you do this, you get this reward. So, contingent rewards in that regard. Then we move from there now to transformational leadership, which is generally considered kind of the most inspirational and motivating type of leadership.
So are you saying that transformational leadership theory, does it feel like that's one of the more recent theories on leadership, generally speaking, like when you kind of gave that history?
Well, it's not as recent anymore. There are some other more recent theories, but it's a very, very widely accepted and widely studied theory. But I mean, it sort of came out of the late '70s, maybe even early '80s. That's where kind of the full range model formed. We'll get into just very quickly before we finish up with that, but inspirational. Um, Motivation is kind of the first I,
Okay, so
which is
these are the 4
the
transformational
four
leaders, right?
I's
Yeah.
of transformational leadership. Inspirational motivation is kind of creating a compelling vision that gets people excited. Idealized influence, which is really the leader as a role model. This is someone I want to be like. Their behavior is modeled after what I aspire to. Um, Individualized consideration, which is exactly the same as the person oriented behaviors that I mentioned earlier in the task versus person oriented. Individualized consideration is literally even the same label that came out in the '50s. And so that's still considered very important. It's basically the leader making you feel like you are valued and supported as an individual. And some leaders are really good at this, even with big groups. You can feel like, hey, this person's really talking to me, even though you may be part of a massive crowd, right? And then the final one is basically intellectual stimulation, and this is the leader providing challenging, intellectually stimulating work, opportunities to grow, learn, develop your career, your personality, who you are as a person, etc. Now, just as a sidetrack, there are lots and lots of other theories now, contemporary theories, that we're not going to get into today, but servant leadership and authentic leadership and charismatic leadership. Authentic leadership, for example, is trying to get into the ethical dimensions of leadership, because even a transformational leader can still be unethical in some ways. So the idea is that there are some more contemporary theories that are a little bit more focused on ethics. But for our purposes, we'll assume, transformational leadership in an ethical kind of context. So that's kind of the background, and those are the basically the four I's of transformational leadership.
Okay. So inspirational, idealized, individualized, and intellectual stimulation. Did I get that right? Those 4? Yeah.
Yes.
Okay, cool. It's kind of fun to hear about leadership, from the books, right? That this is an actual thing that's been studied. It's something that is real, that has got some data behind it, which I think is really exciting. And I guess when I think about, some of what you've been talking about, it I guess this is a question because when I think about leaders, and this in some ways this ends up coming up with some of your students, you think about not individualized in the sense you've described it, but like leadership like on a pedestal, right? Like you're a transformational leader, right? And I'm sure there's like the whole charismatic leader maybe kind of dovetails with that. But that's not really what this is about.
That's right. I mean, transformational leadership, ultimately, it's kind of a bit more about the followers. I mean, there are things though that the leader is expected to model, such as, especially the idealized influence part. But it's really the idea is the onus is on the one in the leadership role to activate, inspire, mobilize, motivate followers. So it's really, in a sense, you could talk about it being follower centered, not to the extent of maybe servant leadership, but the leader really needs to understand followers in order to get them going in the right direction. And just to be clear, when we talk about leadership, real quick, we want to define it, right? Because um, one thing I didn't mention is that leadership research kind of went through a dark period, really in the 60s, 70s. My own field of organizational behavior kind of almost like gave up on leadership research in the 70s. And it's obviously now quite vibrant research area. But some had questioned, do we even need leaders? Is there even such a thing as leadership? Can you really even study leadership, believe it or not? There are a lot of folks kind of thinking about it that way. So I think this really helps get us back to, yes, leadership really does matter, and we got to get people moving in the same direction. But just quickly, so leadership defined is really about uh, energizing, motivating a collective of individuals to achieve common goals based on a shared set of resources. So when we think about leadership, ultimately that's kind of what it's about.
Yeah, when we say leadership, that's what we're talking about. But anyway, I'm kind of glad that you clarified again, and you have the four eyes, right? But I think it was helpful to hear the clarification that transformational leadership really is centered on the followers, like it's follower centric, like you said, and I think that can be really powerful. And I have to say, like, actually, I was just with a client earlier this week, and the client that I was working with, the CEO of this company, fits into this description perfectly. And what's funny, and I know we're not talking about charismatic leadership, but he's not necessarily a charismatic leader, but he is a transformational leader. So it's interesting that you threw that in there. But one of the things that he did, the company's successful, but he's growing it big time, right? Like 3x growth, really quick, and they have the potential, the market is there, they have the foundation, right? So it's possible, but it's gonna still be hard, right? So the things that he was saying was very, inspirational and very, vision oriented, but one of the things that he 2 of the things that he did, one is he was really focused on their goals, so much so that you're talking about like 100 of the top leaders in the company. He actually wanted every single person to literally right there in that session work on their goals and make sure that they were right so that because he wanted them to all ladder up to the mission of the company, right? So that was one piece. And then the other thing that he did, which again, he's not a charismatic kind of person necessarily, but he had this huge poster with like a mountain on it because that was kind of the whole theme, right? And he wanted everyone to sign that poster to say they were committed to the mission. So anyway, I does that resonate?
Absolutely. That's kind of the both the inspirational um, vision aspect, inspirational motivation that he's trying to make sure that everybody's aligned. There's a little bit of individualized consideration there because he's literally making sure everybody is kind of on the same page. So it's as if he's going around the room with each of the 100 people and saying, "Hey, are we on the same page? Are we on the same page?" and making that contract with them. And as well as the intellectual stimulation, because it's challenging. People have to think about the connection between what they're doing and what the overall purpose is. So that requires kind of intellectually rigorous reflection.
I love that. Yeah, no, that's awesome. We're going to get to the students in a second from your class. But when you talk about this theory, are there particular leaders that you use as examples that like people would know, or you know what I mean? Like who do you turn to when you kind of think to illustrate this?
In the particular class that we're going to be hearing the students from, I don't actually go over this theory explicitly. I'd say that we cover components of it in an emergent way, but in a more informal way, because this class that we're going to be talking to or hearing from is an organizational change course. So it's not directly a leadership course, but it's about leading organizational change. So the frameworks are a little bit different. So what we really do is we use some of the protagonists in the cases because we use a case study method, I'll also bring up things that we're hearing in the news literally in real time. If we either hear things that leaders are doing that they shouldn't be doing, and there's plenty of that going around right now, or we're hearing about leaders doing things very effectively, we'll bring that up in the news and have a conversation about it, like what's going wrong here or what's going right here.
Well, and I guess when I think of, leaders, and really good leaders, I mean, I don't know what you think about this, but I almost always think of, leaders really become the leaders that they have the potential to become in the midst of change.
That's true.
You know what I mean? So in some ways it's fitting that, obviously leadership comes up in a big way during your class in organizational change.
Yeah, well, all these eyes that we're hearing about, they become more salient in the midst of change, right? Because change means you need a new vision. Change means you need to inspire people and motivate people. Change means you need to actually tend to people's emotions and understand what they're losing in the change and figure out how to replace that with something even better, ideally. So, yeah, change really, you're absolutely right, kind of brings these things to the surface.
Anything else we should talk about before we go to the students?
Well, let's dive in.
For a long time, I believed that effective leadership was about driving results, even if that meant applying pressure, making tough calls, or sacrificing team morale along the way. So I used to admire leaders who were decisive, assertive, and had a commanding presence. In my mind, charisma and authority were the essence of what made a strong leader. But my perspective began to switch after working under a division leader in my previous company. He fit the mold of the traditional strong leader, so he was highly results-driven, sharply authoritative, and unafraid to push people hard. So on paper, obviously he delivered well. Deadlines were met, KPIs were achieved, but over time the costs became visible. So the team morale was plummeting, talented employees sought transfers, no one wanted to join our team. And while the performance metrics looked healthy, the culture beneath was quietly deteriorating. So this experience made me realize that leadership isn't just about pushing for output, it's about how you bring people with you. So through MBA courses like organizational change, power and influence, I've come to see leadership as an ability to align people around a shared purpose, to foster trust, and to build an environment where people are motivated not by fear but by commitment. But one of the ironies I've observed is that many leaders are placed in systems that reward short-term performance. So this makes it harder to lead with authenticity and invest in long-term culture building. That's why I now believe that effective leadership isn't just about individual skill. It also depends on whether the organization enables that leader to do the right thing. So good leadership requires more than charisma. It requires empathy, clarity of vision, and the ability to cultivate a culture of people that actually want to be a part of.
Hi, I'm Yujin. Before taking the organizational change course, I worked at SK Hynix in the executive management division, where I handled organizational restructuring and executive appointments. At the time, I believed effective leadership was all about being visionary and decisive, driving change from the top, especially when urgency was high and the CEO was leading the effort. But through this course, my perspective changed. I realized that top-down leadership is just one part of the picture, where the lasting change doesn't happen unless people across all levels feel connected to the purpose and believe in the direction. It's not just about telling people what to do, it's about creating emotional alignment and building shared ownership of the change. As an HR manager, this was a wake-up call. I now see that my role is not only about executing leadership decisions, but about helping people understand, adapt, and embrace the change together. Now I define effective leadership as the ability to listen deeply, build trust, and guide people through change in the way that's human, not just strategic. I want to lead projects that shapes culture, projects related to the globalization or launching new products. where I can use my strengths in understanding people and technology and connecting across the organization. This course didn't just shift my definition of leadership, and it gave me a clear vision of the kind of leader I want to become. Thank you for your effort and time, Professor.
Hi, my name is David Rohn. So yeah, before the MBA experience, I would have thought of a good leader as someone who is in a high-level position or manages a group of people and is, really well-spoken and well-regarded. And I think these are all still aspects of a good leader, but the MBA experience really helped me expand on this and kind of see how one could get to this position or how someone could be regarded in this way. And so something that stood out to me right away is when we all started as a cohort and we were all taking the same core classes, there were a handful of people that really stood out in bringing people together. So whether that was hosting a study session for a tough final or being the first to respond, in a Discord when people had homework questions, these people were really going out of their way to help others and leading from the front. And so I think that really helped push me to see, people's actions and how I can be a better leader. And this is something that I aspire to be, having been a financial analyst for my whole career. And I would like to take that next step to be a finance manager where I can manage people. And so I think being a leader, people can rely on and trust, and people see you putting in that work. That's the type of leader where people respond to, and I think that raises the level of performance for the entire team. So thank you.
Hello, my name is Jennifer Yoon, and I'm a manager on the R&D team at the Johnson & Johnson MedTech division. I decided to enroll in an MBA program to enhance my management skills and support my growth within the organization. I was looking forward to learning effective strategies like managing people, projects, and tasks. And yes, the MBA courses certainly provided valuable tools, but also I must say that the overall experience has truly exceeded my expectations. First, my perspective on leadership has shifted from prioritizing individual achievements to understanding the importance of collaboration. I now believe that the successful leaders are those who can unite diverse talents and foster a sense of shared purpose. I have also come to understand the importance of cultivating a growth mindset within the organization. The course taught me on how encouraging employees to view challenges as opportunities for learning is vital for building resilience and driving innovations, which are essential for a company to sustain and grow nowadays. Additionally, the MBA program offered a wider perspective on business. In our hectic daily routines, it's easy to become absorbed in the details and overlook the big picture. The knowledge I gained from the MBA courses has helped me take a step back and adapt a more holistic view. And I believe that this shift is important not only for my professional development, but also for my personal growth. I have a few more semesters to complete before I get my degree, but I truly believe that the time and effort I've invested in my studies will be well worth it. Thank you.
Okay, so this was really interesting. And by the way, just Gerard, thank you so much for offering this as an extra credit, because I think it's so much fun that we've brought in like real voices of real students who, like I said in the introduction, talk about their shift in their view of leadership during your class. So anyway, I just thought what they said was really cool. What did you notice about what they said from where they were to where they are now? Yeah, what are your observations specifically as it relates to transformational leadership theory?
Well, I think there's a couple observations. One is the starting point. And if you hear the starting point for this first group, a lot of it is task oriented, extrinsically motivated, kind of great person theory, that it's really more about the leader. Um, Maybe a little bit of inspiration sprinkled in for good measure, but a lot of it is about the positional power of the person. Um, and it's really about extrinsic rewards. And where they've moved is to understanding the importance of bringing people along. So, like, hey, Jay, that first one we heard talking about uh, the importance of shared purpose, fostering trust, people being motivated by commitment instead of fear, which is much harder to do. Those are the features of transformational leadership that we were just talking about: inspirational motivation, inspirational motivation, intellectual stimulation, um, building trust, building relationship, idealize influence, trying to set an example. So I think we're hearing from these students a move from more extrinsic task orientation to, it really matters to get people on board, to get them inspired, to get them motivated and aligned, moving in the same direction, building relationship, building trust. I'm looking here also. Let's see it. Yoon was talking about the importance of collaborating, uniting, fostering a shared sense of purpose. One of the things that was mentioned there, um, cultivating a growth mindset. So this is really about the intellectual stimulation element associated with that. So I think in shifting, impacting professional and personal growth, also a nod to intellectual stimulation there. So I think that that's inspiring to me to hear students making that shift, making that transformation through their MBA program.
Yeah, it's pretty awesome actually. And one of the things that I guess I noticed was, um, you know, it just kind of reinforces what you've just said, but there's sort of like the leader on the pedestal versus the collaboration, right? So, kind of seeing that leader up here and kind of idealizing that person versus like, no, let's bring everyone together. Let's like, figure out how to do more integration and that being valued rather than that leader being up on a pedestal.
Yeah, that's a good point. So we call this in there's what's called the Globe Project, which was started at University of Pennsylvania. It's basically a project where they look at values across cultures. And one of the universal values is what we call power distance. And power distance is the distance between leaders and followers, kind of like the imagined distance as measured by power. Leaders are more powerful. There's more distance between the follower and the leader in high power distance cultures versus lower power distance cultures like our culture is supposed to be. I say supposed to be because there's apparently been some changes of late, but the US and West is supposed to be a lower power distance culture than, say, Asia or Mexico, as examples. But what we're seeing even with these students is there was a shift from a higher power distance notion of the leader, like you're saying, up on a pedestal, a little bit more dictatorial, task oriented, someone to be revered and feared maybe to some extent, to a lower power distance where the leader is there working alongside, helping, supporting, inspiring, not dictating, so to speak.
And what's interesting is that, presumably all the students that you've talked to, I mean, they're all in the workforce. It's not like, they're already
Oh yeah, these are, yeah.
right. So they're presumably, if they're not leaders, they are about to be, right? So they're either for sure leaders or they're gonna, be on that track very soon.
Well, these students from Carnegie Mellon, they're actually really quite accomplished. I had, students that are senior executive level students. Most of these, if not all of them, were actually in positions of leadership already where they are managing and leading others. So, yeah, definitely people with experience.
Yeah, that's what I thought. So I think that's important to note actually, because I think it's fascinating that, that they have made that switch, right? The old views that they've had to the new views. And I think that's really, tremendous that if they weren't sort of learning that on the job, right, for whatever reason, there was an insight that happened as they were getting, their MBA and focusing on some of these skills. In fact, I mean, I don't know, this is just anecdotal evidence, but like a lot of people that have like a lot of my clients who have MBAs, whenever the conversation has come up about the value of an MBA, so many times people have told me that one of the classes that they value the most that they wish they would have taken more of are the classes that you teach, right? Organizational change, leadership, right? How to deal with people.
Yeah, and unfortunately, that insight usually comes to them 5 years after they graduate, often, not always, but when they're rising in the organization in positions of responsibility and are thinking, "Oh, dang, I should have taken more of those classes because 'cause I'm dealing with these issues now." You're absolutely right, and I do think that
Which is
those.
where I come in, by the way.
Yeah, exactly. They need you. So maybe I'll tell the students don't take those classes, but go to Winnie when you're done. Yeah.
No, 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 no. No, don't do that.
Okay.
Yeah, no, but it's true. Like, I mean, but I think it is interesting though that they do see the value. And I don't know about other students, but obviously the people that you talk to, they are saying that even in the midst of taking these classes, not 5 years later, they're now realizing that there's that value and that they're seeing it differently, which I think is amazing.
Yes, and that's actually one of the most rewarding experiences for me as a professor is when I hear students telling me, and they tell me in class, "I'm implementing this in real time. I just did what we talked about last week, this past week in my organization, and it's really helping me." And when I hear those things, it's just music to my ears. That's just one of the most fulfilling things that you can experience.
Oh my gosh, yeah, it is. It really is. And the thing is what's so cool again is that, they're really, and I'm not teaching. I mean, that's the difference, right? So I'm not teaching theory, you are, right? But I think it's and that's why I'm so glad you're on the show because I feel like that theory and grounding it in theory, it really makes it more real kind of. You know what I mean? I mean, I offer tools. In fact, the program that I did earlier this week, I was offering like tangible tools, to make leadership and leadership behavior that is desirable, like concrete and doable. But, so there's that. But, you're doing that too in terms of like grounding some of these behaviors and ways of doing leadership differently in theory. And it works.
Well, there's a famous old saying from Kurt Lewin, who was a professor at MIT years and years ago. He studied organizational change, and he used to say, "There's nothing as practical as a good theory," and that's absolutely true. Because if you've got a good theory, you actually have a way to make sense of things and to predict what will happen if you do A, B, and C. So you're absolutely right.
Okay, good. Yes. So, okay, so we just heard from the students who talked about transformational leadership and their old view versus their new view. Gerard, what are your thoughts on what was said and kind of what they came up with in terms of contrasting those two views?
So the first thing from a full range leadership model, we talked about the full range leadership model, going from laissez-faire to management by exception or micromanaging to transactional to transformational. What I heard from a number of these students was a more transactional leadership style was their prior assumption. Um, I heard Berman talk about being task oriented. I heard Zarate talk about being very task oriented. I heard about this emphasis on power, coercive power, expert power from Whittle, coercive power from Zarate. So there was this kind of movement from a more transactional approach up the scales of the full range model to a more transformational approach. So Berman really emphasized the importance of inspirational motivation dimension of transformational leadership. He was talking about learning to motivate and inspire others, setting you up for long term success in that way by getting people to internalize their goals. Saber actually covered all four I's: inspirational motivation, idealized influence, individualized consideration, and to some extent, intellectual stimulation, embodying the vision, walking the talk, with a lot of urgency. That's really about idealized influence there, and a sense of purpose, being able to communicate all levels of the organization. That's sort of the inspirational motivation, helping people feel connected to it. That's both the individualized consideration and inspirational uh, motivation there. And then Whittle also was talking about guiding a team beyond that technical know-how, laying out the strategic vision. We see the inspirational motivation there, inspiring the team, um, individualized consideration, helping people overcome roadblocks, connecting the team to the larger enterprise strategy. So there, yeah, we definitely see those levels. And then finally, Zarate was talking about being more than metrics, but being about empathy, purpose. So that's back to the idea of inspirational motivation, showing up, being someone that others can rely on, that they feel supported. So we see the individualized consideration there. So yeah, definitely we're seeing some of those eyes show up. So moving from a more transactional to a more transformational approach, which is very inspiring to see.
The thing that stood out to me is it's almost like in their old view, there was a higher value on IQ, and in their new view, there was a higher value on EQ,
Oh, I love it.
which I
Yeah,
know
that's a
are
great
two
way.
different theories,
No, that's a
right?
great
I
way
mean,
to
those
say
are
it. Yeah.
different theories we haven't touched on. Do you see that?
Oh, absolutely. And I think that, the idea of, emotional intelligence is really kind of part and parcel with the, I'd say, individualized consideration dimension of transformational leadership, because it's really about understanding people, being supportive, empathetic. And Zarate was definitely touching
Yeah,
on
being
that.
tuned
Yeah.
into that.
Yeah. Absolutely.
That maybe is too simplistic, but that's really what stood out to me, that, they are kind of making that shift of like, oh, the leader is technically competent. They know what to do. They know it better than anyone else versus, the EQ, which is like, oh, maybe they don't even have to know all the technical details and they can still be a great leader because they have these other qualities that they're using to be a good leader, right? Which I think is kind of cool. So that stood out to me. And I think that there's also, another part that stood out to me was just like just more communicating. I don't know, like this feels like a one way, like the old view is like a one-way, communication channel, and the other one is like a two-way communication channel. I don't know if that stood out to you either.
Yeah, no, that's a great way to describe it. And yeah, transactional, there is a little bit of a two-way, but it's more like, here's the deal. Do you accept or not? And it's like thumbs up or thumbs down. Okay, thumbs up. Okay, go get the work done. So that's it. You're off. Go get the work done. Whereas, yeah, in the transformational leadership, it's more let's have a conversation, etc.
Yeah, exactly, exactly. No, that's great. That's really cool. And again, I think it's really fun to see the students that you have, the changes that their mindset shifts that they're going through, is not only exciting because they're actually, they're really learning something and they're applying it like you were saying before, but it's also like such a great shift. I mean, the fact that it's so much richer the way that they're seeing leadership to me.
It gives us hope, doesn't it?
It does. It really, really does. Speaking of theory, let's go to our next theory, which is self-determination theory, which just sounds so American somehow. I'm not saying it is. But anyway, so yeah, could you do the same that you did with the other one and kind of just introduce this theory, what it is, if there's background behind it that's helpful? Yeah, so I'll turn it
Well,
over
you're
to you.
right. It was started in America. Actually, Edward Deasy, who I found out later was a student at Carnegie Mellon. Edward Deasy did his MBA at Wharton, and then he eventually went back to Carnegie Mellon to do his PhD in psychology. And he got very interested in intrinsic motivation. And so Deci and Ryan became lifelong colleagues. And although it was a theory that started here in America, it is a global phenomenon now, and probably one of the dominant theories in motivation now. And so we're sort of importing motivation now into the area of leadership. And the basic premise of self determination theory is extremely simple. It's that we have three innate psychological, what are referred to as organismic needs. Don't mispronounce that word, but they're organismic, meaning that they're important for us as organisms. And those three needs are the need for autonomy, which is where the self determination comes in. That is autonomy, meaning the need to make our own choices, our own decisions, to be agentic, to feel effectual in that way. The need for competence, so autonomy, competence, the need to have mastery over our environment, to be good at what we do, to develop and learn. So very much in line with intellectual stimulation that we heard about with transformational theory or transformational leadership theory. And then the third need is the need for relatedness, which is the need for meaningful social connection. And we know there's just so much research now on healthy relationships as being the kind of holy grail of longevity and well-being, both physically, mentally, emotionally, psychologically. There's the longstanding happiness project at Harvard University that's been going on since 1938, and it's still going on. And what they find over and over again is relationships matter for long-term happiness. So autonomy, competence, and relatedness. These are the three critical needs. So the basic way to sort of port this over to leadership is it's therefore the leader's role. Well, let me back up first, real quick. So the motivation is happening on a continuum from amotivation, which is you're sitting in your bed, laying in your bed, looking at your phone, doing nothing. That's a state of amotivation. You don't want to do anything at all. To more extrinsic motivation, where you're motivated by fear or avoidance of punishment, the most external form, to a continuum where we begin to internalize more and more, without going through all the nuances, um, more and more of what we do and what motivates us becomes a part of who we are, until the point where the purest form of intrinsic motivation, and you've probably heard of the idea of flow. It's like when we're in a state of flow where we're almost like losing track of time. We're so absorbed in what we're doing in the task that we become almost effectively one with the task. So that's kind of the state of pure intrinsic motivation. And the benefits, the virtues of intrinsic motivation are, one is self-concordance. It's like making sure that the goals that we pursue and our values are congruent. So that's this idea of self-concordance. What we do is kind of who we are, and also persistence. That we're going to be more likely to kind of persist and work harder and experience fulfillment and enjoyment more fully. So the basic idea is when we pursue these needs in our lives, we're more intrinsically motivated and we're happier and we're thriving. When those needs are thwarted, we are less happy. We are more extrinsic, more robotic, more, externally determined kind of in our actions. So the from this perspective, the role of the leader is ultimately about creating conditions and an environment that enables people to thrive in that way. So we saw the, idealized, or sorry, individualized consideration very much maps to, for example, the relatedness need, as intellectual stimulation very much maps to the competence need. And the idea of inspirational motivation to some extent maps to autonomy, as long as people can figure out how they can place themselves into the framework of whatever the vision is for the organization or the organizational unit that you're working for, so to speak. So the goal of the manager, the leader, is what we call autonomy support. And so that is basically to support the autonomy of your people, to encourage them to be proactive, to make choices when choices are not possible, because there are times when choices are not possible. You're working on an assembly line. You got to turn a screw this way. You can't turn it the other way. There's no choice. You provide a reason and an understanding and a rationale for why that is the case. So, but if there are degrees of freedom, then you do provide those degrees of freedom. You listen to your employees, you try to hear their voices, you try to understand and accommodate what their idiosyncrasies are, et cetera. You provide an environment where they can develop skills, where they can be competent, and you try to promote effective and productive working relationships with them, right? Where people feel supported. So that's really ultimately the goal from a self-determination theory standpoint.
So yeah, so I love this topic, motivation, and there's Daniel Pink. There's a bunch of people. The one that I've been using with the clients and some of the programs that I do is Kenneth Thomas. So intrinsic motivation at work. It's interesting. One thing that you noted, which I've never mentioned or thought of, is like the other extreme, which is like you're not motivated at all.
Yeah, that's motivation. Yeah.
I love what you said about creating the leadership condition. Leadership creates the conditions for which people can have self-determination, which is, about motivation. But I really thought it was important that you pointed out this whole idea that where it's possible, right? And then where it's not possible, maybe, like remember that whole story about like three people are painting or building bricks for, a cathedral. One is like, I'm just laying a wall. Another one's I'm making it really strong. I'm making it the best it can be. Another one's, they're creating a cathedral for, people to come worship, right? But it's like, they're all doing the same thing. So I imagine though that depending on the possibility of where there can be self-determination, you can maybe create self-determination, but in a different way. Would you agree with that?
Oh, absolutely. So your goal there is to try to provide choices where they're possible. And this is something I like about Dan Pink is Dan Pink adds in this fourth idea of purpose. And the idea of purpose is where things fit into the bigger picture. So purpose is kind of the way that you get at autonomy when you can't even provide it. I like to think of the example of an aircraft carrier. Everyone in an aircraft carrier, except for the pilots who fly, has one job, and the job is get the airplanes off the aircraft carrier safely, get them back on safely. That's all that they care about. And that requires mechanistic, standardized jobs and works very tactical. And you cannot, there's zero room of variation. There is no room for creativity when you're trying to stop a plane on an aircraft carrier, right? So you can't give autonomy, but what you can give is a sense of purpose that what I'm doing is I'm enhancing the safety, and the better I am at my job, the safer the pilots will be. So there's a way to create a sense of purpose, and in that you're kind of activating a little bit of autonomy even if you don't have a choice. And and sometimes in organizations it's the same thing.
Yeah, it reminds me actually of a client that I was working with. He was like an executive at it was like an environmental consulting firm. So it was a consulting firm essentially, but focused on environmental issues. And he was having trouble with his direct reports. Not trouble, but like his direct reports were perceiving him as not offering self determination. And he felt like they were micromanaging him, whatever. And so I brought up actually Kenneth Thomas's theory, and I said, well, you should kind of think about what motivates your people, right? And so we talked about all the different aspects in the model, which are similar to the ones you've been talking about. And he was like, well, competence, I value competency. That's what motivates me. And it's like, and what he said was, I can't imagine any of these other things motivating people except for competency. Because we're a consulting firm and like, we're making money and that's like all, we're focused on that, blah, blah, blah. And I said, okay, well, just try it, send it to your direct reports, have them look at it, and then say, we're going to talk, one on one this day. And I want to know like what motivates you out of these or what your thoughts are. And he came back to me and he said, "Oh my gosh, these people are motivated by other things besides like competency." He was shocked. But I mean, but that kind of brings up this whole idea of like what's possible. And people think like, oh, it's not possible, but maybe it is. People are interpreting things differently?
Well, what's fascinating about these three needs, there have been studies, there was a very, very large scale study done with something in the order of like 12,000 subjects. across, I'm trying to remember, I don't remember the precise number of countries, but it was over a dozen countries. It may have even been closer to 20. And it was across the developed and developing world. It was across Europe, Asia, Latin America. It was all cultures, and everybody was represented basically. And effectively, they find these three needs bubble up as the critical needs that people have, whether they're rich or poor, whether they make a lot of money or they don't have a lot of money, whether they're in the East or in the West. So there's really empirical validation for these needs. The other thing that's kind of important to recognize along this continuum, as I said, is that most forms of extrinsic motivation, according to self determination theory, are functional. They're important. Um, Intrinsic is a really, really tiny sliver. So you kind of go across the spectrum, and you have introjected extrinsic is a good place to be. In fact, sometimes intrinsic can have its dark sides as well, like with video gaming and things like that. People can get so absorbed into the task that they start to wear diapers, for example, because they don't want to go to the bathroom. Yeah, and those things happen. We've heard these stories about gamers who are like wearing diapers and doing nothing but gaming, right?
That's crazy. No, but I'm actually glad you brought that up because when working with executives on this theory, and even when I do training on it, because I have a training program around it too, is that it really I always point out, and it's really important to note that both are good, right? Extrinsic motivation is good. The bonuses, the salary, right? The benefits that you get, like let's not those aren't going away. Like those are needed. Right? And right, and you want to figure out, and this is the other thing that I kind of talk about is like, it's not necessarily up to you as the leader to help other people figure out like you have to like tell them they should figure it out, and you can coach them and help them, but the whole intrinsic thing, it's intrinsic, like they kind of have to figure it out.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that's right. And you can't get away from the fact that we work for an income. Most of us do.
That's right. We can't get away from that.
Some don't have to, and if they don't, that's fantastic. Like philanthropy would be absolutely wonderful. But for most of us, we do have extrinsic motivators to consider as well.
That's right, and those are good ones. Okay, cool. So let's go to the students and let's talk to them, and then we'll come back and see what they had to say. These are the words of Arthur Berman. I used to think effective leadership was simply about attaining success through results. Whether it be in sports, careers, or in general, I thought striving to be at the top and leading in that sense is what being an effective leader was all about. The CMU program so far has helped broaden my thought processes overall. With leadership specifically, it has shown me that an effective leader goes far beyond just being a successful individual, and even as a team, but rather has an emphasis on how your words and actions motivate those around you. No matter what the setting is or what the goal is, I've grown in my ability to understand and aim for long-term success. What I mean is, the end result of a current goal or project or job should not be the only vision, but rather just the first goal on the road of larger ones. And when it comes to being the leader, I've learned that how you go about the first goal and the way you carry yourself and motivate those around you is what will set you up for the later ones. In essence, even if you successfully complete something, it most likely will not result in anything else if you are unable to compel those around you to work for you and hire you. I also have now understood that this would save you in times where you do not succeed at your goal and would help get you another chance. In the words of Scott Saber, I'm going to be describing how I used to define effective leadership, how I define it now, and what experiences prompted me to change my definition of effective leadership. So initially, I thought effective leadership as the ability to translate high-level aspirations into day-to-day operations. That definition felt somewhat distant and difficult to connect with. It was hard to see how my individual contributions were tied into the bigger picture. However, after I took the course in organizational change, my perspective has evolved. I can now define effective leadership as embodying the vision you know, walking the talk with a strong sense of urgency and purpose. Truly effective leaders can communicate their vision at all levels of an organization and make people feel connected to it. That level of clarity and alignment is not easy to achieve, but it's what sets great leaders apart. What crystallized this for me was during my time as a process engineer, splitting my work between the lab and the field. I often questioned how my work contributed to the organization's broader goals. In hindsight, that disconnect stems from my limited visibility into strategic objectives, as well as a lack of one-on-one conversations with leadership that could have provided that context. Since then, a lot has changed. The organization has welcomed a new leadership team. I've transitioned roles twice, and I've gained formal training and leadership. Now in my current role as the pricing and estimation manager, I aim to provide my team with the clarity I once lacked. I encourage them to think about the bigger picture, emphasizing incremental progress and instill in our daily work a sense of urgency and purpose, always with alignment to broader organizational goals. Thank you.
Hi, my name's Lenita. I'm a senior business manager for a Global 200 company. When I think about how I would define effective leadership, I used to define it as someone who, or a leader that was very technical and could lead a team technically, and being able to get in there and really be able to do the things that the team was doing and have the technical know-how. However, I will say, as I have grown in my career, how I now define effective leadership is really a leader who can guide a team beyond the technical know-how, that they can remove roadblocks for the team, inspire the team, and also lay out a strategic vision for the team and get the sponsorship from upper executive leadership teams to be able to do the things that the team wants to do, but also connect those to the larger enterprise strategy at the company or firm. And that's something that I think what has changed that is really just the growth of how I progressed through my career and how I aspire to be a leader for my team. As I get more advanced and have more experiences, I tend to have less technical experience. So I do lean in on more effective leadership with my team, being able to empower them to really lean in on their technical skills and remove roadblocks for them so they can do the best work that they can do. So to me now, that's the definition of effective leadership.
These are in the words of Jose Zarte. On June 23rd, 2025, I'll reach 20 years of service in the military, 2 full decades. It's hard to believe, and honestly, it makes me feel a little old. But those years have shaped how I understand leadership, and more importantly, how that understanding has changed. When I first started, I thought leadership was about control, authority, and results. In basic training, leadership meant turning civilians into soldiers, and through strict discipline, pressure, and rewards or punishments. Later in my career, it became about evaluations and awards. If you got those, it meant you were doing it right. That was my definition of a good leader. But over time, that definition started to feel too narrow. Through my experiences, and especially during this program, I've come to believe that effective leadership is about more than just performance metrics. It's about empathy, purpose, and the ability to give clear direction. It's about showing up consistently and being someone people can rely on, especially when things get difficult. Some of the best leaders I've worked with are the ones who stayed calm under pressure. They didn't create confusion or chaos. They communicated clearly and made sure people felt supported and understood. They didn't need to raise their voice to be heard. This shift in how I see leadership didn't happen all at once. It's been a process of learning, failing, and reflecting. Today, I define leadership not by rank or recognition, but by trust, clarity, and the ability to lead with both strength and compassion. we just heard from four of your students talking about self-determination. Just so happens that there was weaved in some of that transformational leadership, which we just talked about.
So there's very much kind of this SDT feeling, but we also see the hints of transformational leadership. And as we were talking about, there's that connection between, for example, relatedness need and individualized consideration. There's that connection between intellectual stimulation and competence need. There's that connection, albeit a little bit more indirect, between inspirational motivation and autonomy by helping people feel how they fit into the overall mission. So they're also kind of through those covering transformational leadership. And there has been a lot of research that's been done on that connection between transformational leadership as a style and intrinsic motivation. And transformational leaders do inspire more intrinsically motivated followers. So yeah, we're seeing that, and that's really kind of encouraging to see.
Yeah, right. No, that's a really interesting point. That last point about transformational leadership, and tying it in with the self determination, intrinsic motivation, and that they were able to put those together. That those students were able to put those together. I think that's amazing. Yeah, and I guess one of the things that I noticed too was in this was you know them kind of putting leaders on a pedestal, versus like, collaboration and bringing people together and kind of really thinking about their own leadership as not just, or not even just their own leadership, but leaders, right? Being like on a pedestal. I mean, which with with that meaning maybe, always being right. They don't say that, right? They talk about being well spoken, well regarded, but like kind of an individual leader, right? But this, in their new view, it was really about collaboration and bringing them along and, tapping into what people care about, which is really intrinsic motivation. So I don't know. It was just very encouraging to see that shift.
Yeah, and very much also as I don't know if we had mentioned this earlier, this idea of power distance is a key attribute. So this idea of power distance, that uh, power distance is this notion of in higher power distance cultures, the leader is farther from the follower because the more powerful you are, the further away you are from the follower. Whereas in lower power distance cultures like the United States, or at least we could say the United States used to be that way. It's hopefully we make a comeback, but that we're supposed to be at least a lesser power distance, so that there is less distance between leaders and followers. The idea that leaders can listen and connect and inspire followers at kind of equal footing. They definitely went from a higher power distance view of leadership to a lower power distance view of leadership, where the leader's job is not to direct and dictate and tell you what to do and give you rewards and focus on transactions, but it's more about inspiring you, motivating you, getting you to internalize the mission and really feel like you're part of something bigger than yourself.
Again, I think we might have said this already, but like the fact that there are theories and research behind this that, validate that this works and this can be powerful in terms of leaders having an impact, which I imagine no matter what kind of leader you are, you want to have an impact. You want to feel like the leadership that take on is effective. And so I think that it's really, encouraging that, that this is something that's real and really is effective.
Yeah. Well, I think a lot of leadership and a lot of theories in organizational behavior, even psychology, are based on observation. So it's not surprising that we can build these theories from the ground up.
Exactly. And, and again, it's encouraging, kind of like the story that I shared with this client who was like, "Oh, you can only be it's obvious you can only be motivated in this way in this industry." But that there is so much there that's possible in terms of people being motivated. And, on the one hand, I guess as a leader, you could see that as overwhelming and like, "Oh my gosh, all these people." But like I was saying earlier, it shouldn't leaders shouldn't feel the burden of like, I have to now motivate all these people, which I think is sort of a myth that maybe it's just in America more, but maybe in the Western world, where there is this feeling that like, oh, it's my responsibility as a leader to do this. Like I have to motivate people. And even though the leader can certainly create the conditions in which people are motivated. That's different than you just directly have to motivate them all the time. I don't know. Does that resonate with kind of what you think about?
Well, I think it does, with a little bit of a qualifier is because I think part of the leader's job is also to understand what motivates Winnie, what motivates you, and to provide a little bit of customization to the extent possible around what the work is in a way that matches the work to what your motivators are. And that said, we have to recognize not everyone is intrinsically motivated. I believe that the more we move towards the intrinsic end of the spectrum, the more we're going to thrive as human beings. But some are more extrinsically motivated than others. I mean, salespeople are a great example. I'm not stereotyping here, but people go into sales, they're motivated by money, they're motivated by the independence, by the achievement that they get from meeting their targets and their goals. And there's a certain personality profile that fits with that. And that's the leading edge of the organization. We need people who are extrinsically motivated to get as much commission as they can to help drive the performance of the organization. And they're not going to be working in R&D where they're just, enjoying the intellectual stimulation and building new things and tinkering and so forth. But we need both um, roles within the organization. So there is no judgment. There's nothing wrong with folks being a little bit more extrinsically motivated on that side. You just have to accommodate that and understand that and then pattern the work after what those needs are.
The thing that I would add to that too is I think that while, you're right, I think the leader needs to figure out, okay, individually what motivates Gerard, right? I think it's not always up to me to figure out what that is, right? So it's like there has to be some kind of conversation to understand what it is. And then maybe even a conversation together around what's possible, right? Because, instead of me doing it in a vacuum, it's like it's a conversation or more to say, "Oh, helping you understand what motivates you," right? By some good questions, but then also like, "Okay, now that we know that, what's possible given the company, where your role, what else is happening, in the industry or whatever," and figuring that out.
Yeah, exactly. That's like we were talking about earlier, the limits on autonomy. It's not always possible to give people autonomy on that aircraft carrier, on an assembly line, when you're engineering safety on an aircraft. We don't want freelancers. When you're doing my taxes, for crying out loud, I do not want a lot of creativity there. I want you to follow the rules, do your job, stay within your stay in your lane, so to speak.
Yeah, exactly. Let's zoom out. What any I mean, I guess like anything that you are thinking about as you kind of connect the dots between the two theories and what the students have said, or, what advice, someone's listening, the person listening right now who's either like a brand new leader about to go to B school, or just in the middle of being a leader and kind of taking, they're now being expected to take things to the next level. What advice would you give them, give this person based on kind of everything we've been talking about today?
So I think if you think about the two theories, the one that's easier to remember and to implement in my mind is self-determination theory. And you can't go wrong with that because if you're a autonomy supportive leader, chances are if you as long as you add that vision part to it, you're transformational in your style. So we saw the connection between, autonomy and kind of the inspirational motivation aspect, helping people feel like they're part of a bigger purpose, the competence and the intellectual stimulation, and then individualized consideration and relatedness need. And if you think about it, if you're modeling that, you're meeting the idealized influence I or criterion also. So the basic kind of bottom line then is as you're leading, as you're managing, and just even as you're interacting with colleagues and others, whether they're above you or below you or on your same level, think about the autonomy, think about competence, think about your relationship with them. How can I build skills? How can I help them build skills? How can I exercise proactivity? How can I encourage others to be proactive? How can I build meaningful reciprocal relationships, and how can I help others do that? And I think you're never going to go wrong if you're thinking about those three needs at work and also at home, no matter where you are. So,
That's right. I really appreciate the fact that you brought up peer to peer and up and like you did the whole 360 because I think we forget about that as leaders, kind of, and I think and I talk with my clients about this really all the time. Is when you think about like the enterprise impact or you think about the overall and organizational impact you want to have as a leader, it's not just your direct reports, right? It's your peers. That plays a huge role. So you're right. You can use self-determination theory and transformational leadership theory with your peers, right? And I don't think we think about that enough.
absolutely, absolutely. Yeah, you're absolutely right.
Anything else you want to say, Gerard? Anything else that I didn't ask you that I should have that you want to like get out there before we close?
No, I think this was great. I really appreciate the opportunity, and I hope folks have enriched their idea of what leadership is and able to distinguish it from great person theory. Because down with great person theory, we need less and less great person theory and more leadership theory and leaders who are supportive or who exercise leadership, not just assert power.
I love that. I think that's really powerful. So that's like, I think, a perfect place to end it. So thank you so much, Gerard, for being here and talking to me about leadership. And thank you to your students so much for being on the show.
All right. Thanks, Winnie.
So this episode wraps up our series on leadership in higher education. A huge thanks to Gerard Beenen and his students at Carnegie Mellon for offering us a window into the current and future state of leadership. Their honesty and insights give us all something to learn, whether we're in school, in business, or somewhere in between. As you think about this conversation in relationship to your own leadership, here are a few questions you may want to ponder. What assumptions about leadership are you still carrying around? How might you create more trust, clarity, and ownership on your team? And which leadership theory best describes your growth as a leader today? Or which one do you want to grow more in? If you're ready to take your leadership to the next level or empower your teams for success, I'm here to help. Reach out to me directly at winnie@winifred.org or check out my website at www.winniedasilva.com to learn more about my work in coaching executives, developing critical leadership teams, and working with clients to build effective teams. You can also find me on Substack and LinkedIn. Whether you're engaging with me online, suggesting topics, or joining the conversation on social media, your voice is a vital part of this podcast. Because you are always welcome to take a seat at the table where every conversation has the potential for transformative change.